I'm really delighted to be here today. I've done some work with Ian already. We've done some trainings around authenticity. And I'm delighted to be here to talk to you about a little bit about authenticity, but also about, more broadly, the struggles that women face in the 21st century and how to face them authentically. So a little bit about me then. I, as Anne has said, I'm a consultant in domestic abuse and sexual violence. I am the founder of ACT by Laura Currer that does the work that Anne described, which is going into organisations and helping them to understand why domestic abuse and sexual violence matters to them, and fundamentally it does. This is everyone's issue, and if I can give you one message today, it's that this is an issue that is unfortunately insidious and that matters to all of us, and that we all have the power to impact and change. I'm also the owner, coach and a trainee psychotherapist at Sparkle with Laura Currer. I'm an expert in lived experience, so I was really interested in some of the conversations this morning around neurodiversity, and I loved hearing the words and the messages from the students, from the girls, around don't tell us that it's a superpower. don't kind of put us in this box or that box or give us that label. Fundamentally, you are creating services then or kind of programs, responses with lived experience at the heart. It's massively well intentioned to think about, here's what we think will be the solution, here's what we think is the right thing to do. Actually, sense check that, always. And it's great to hear that you're doing that in the work around neurodiversity and other things. And it's something that I care really deeply about when it comes to sexual violence and domestic abuse, because in that arena, the person then has been totally disempowered and had their voice taken from them. And even a well-intentioned voice for them can be triggering and disempowering. I'm a graduate scheme alumni. I have worked in private and public sector leadership for the last 10 years, predominantly in health. And I'm a mentor and a mentee of young women. So just to kind of outline from the start, obviously some of the conversations that we'll be having, some of the issues that we're talking about are sensitive. So I want to kind of reinforce that this is a safe space to discuss and ask questions with no judgment. Language is really important. We've had that again with neurodiversity this morning. It's especially important in relation to sexual violence and domestic abuse, where different labels or kind of boxes are placed on people, as Erin talked about. For the purpose of this presentation, when I talk about people who've experienced sexual violence, I might refer to them as victims. I know that language can feel difficult, but I'm just putting that out there now and explaining that in this context, that's the language that we'll use. I'm available to chat privately after the session, in case you don't feel comfortable speaking here or you want to follow up on something. And we will be discussing themes that might be difficult or triggering, including topics relating to sexual violence. So please keep yourself safe. If you want to dip out at any point or excuse yourself to go to the loo or make a cuppa, please feel free. In the interests of vulnerability then, to tell you a little bit about my story and why I got into this work. I was 22. I had just finished a graduate scheme, following a master's, following my undergrad degree, following a school education, and I had really neatly followed the path that had been set out for me. Tick, tick, tick. I'd checked all of the boxes. I was just finishing my master's, just about to start the graduate scheme that I had wanted to do. Brilliant. I was moving down from Newcastle to Leeds to relocate for the scheme, and everything was going perfectly to plan until 2 weeks before I went on a night out in Newcastle with two friends, two men that I knew and trusted, and I was spiked and raped by both of them. And that really, for me, changed the trajectory of everything. Because everything that I thought in the kind of pre-programmed world of this is the next step, that's the next step, was entirely turned on its head. What happened after that was I reported it to the police, but did still move down to Leeds. So I moved down to Leeds and had the first 4 months of my working career between two cities, effectively working in Leeds, studying in Leeds, and then back up to the northeast for police investigations and all of those other things. And really sadly, after 4 months, it was deemed that there wasn't enough evidence to take it to court, which some of you are shaking your heads around the room, that's not a surprise. And we'll talk about some of those stats later on. But what that meant then was that I was left kind of starting in my career and just off the edge of a cliff, it felt, in terms of there was no support around for me. I didn't know what to do, where to look. And the project manager in me reflected on the efficiencies of some of the processes that I had experienced and the police process and the health process and all of the different interventions. And some of the interventions that I had when I first disclosed from medics and from others were so healing and so therapeutic and really restored my faith in humanity. And some aspects were really poor, and I fell through the gaps and I didn't get the support that I needed. And there was nothing around like mentorship. And it sounds like a reach, but it isn't. When you've experienced that, you want someone who gets it. You want to go and be able to access a service where you feel like you, fundamentally, your authentic self, because something has happened to you that has shaken your foundation and you don't feel like you anymore. And it's super hard to be embodied and authentic because effectively your body, at least for me, was the scene of a crime. And you can't get away from that. How do you then feel embodied and feel like yourself and all of those things? I could not find a service that felt like me. And it made me realise then that we are making people choose between accessing support or changing themselves to fit the services that are available. And that's not a choice that I'm okay with. That just doesn't feel okay for me. And I have a scheme, I'll talk about it a little bit later on, called the Sparkle Scholarship, which is a mentorship scheme for young women in schools who've experienced some kind of sexual violence or domestic abuse. And the main piece of feedback that we get is, you just get it. It feels like us. We don't feel like not ourselves anymore. For me personally, the prospect of being given a leaflet to go to a support group in the back end of nowhere, in a community centre where everybody, no disrespect, it'll be fit for somebody, but where everybody seemed really dour and depressed and downtrodden. For some people at that time, that would have been exactly what they needed. For me, it felt like another step further away from my authentic self, from the person that I was. And I really resented it. I really resented having to occupy spaces then that didn't feel like me because of something that other people had done to me. In my case, 2 other people had done to me. So because of that, I set up Sparkle to create spaces where people were given the permission to still be themselves and get the support that they needed. Spaces that didn't always feel dour or depressing, that felt hopeful and uplifting, because a message that I had heard a number of times was that my life was ruined, my life was over, my life would never be the same again. I wasn't going to be able to achieve what I wanted to achieve in my personal life or in my professional life. And those messages were quite insidious, really, and I think took some time to then kind of undo. So I created Sparkle. And that was so rewarding and wonderful, and I'd still do that work, and I love that work. But it made me realise that we're dealing with the symptom and not the cause. So let's support women, yes, let's give them the support that they need. But what are we doing further upstream? And how are we stopping this kind of crazy level and trajectory of the amount of people who experience sexual violence or domestic abuse? So I set up ACT and work with corporations, big corporations, also public and private sector, to be able to look at how we as a society respond to this massive issue that is sexual violence and domestic abuse, violence against women, gender-based violence. But it's not just the police and the NHS that have an impact on this. This is, I'll talk about it in a few slides' time, but 1 in 3 women will experience sexual violence or domestic abuse at some point in their lives. P.S. That's the number that is shared. So that's how many people report and identify with having experienced it. The prediction is that actually is far higher. When you think of that then, that's 1/3 of your staff, that's 1/3 of your workforce, that's 1/3 of your customer base if you're in private business. It's a huge issue. So that's why that's my story, that's why I'm here today, and I'll talk to you a little bit more about how we respond to that then systemically as educators with individuals, and I'll also talk a little bit about authentically me and some of the ways that we might be able to help some of you in relation to this. So what's the reality then? We've touched on a lot of this, but here is a study that I will quote to you all briefly. Over half of teenage girls are suffering from poor mental health, a major study has found. Of almost 13,000 teenagers in year 11 interviewed, 54% of girls reported elevated psychological distress. Almost a quarter said that they had self-harmed in the last year, and 11% had attempted suicide. A third of teenage boys in the same cohort reported psychological distress, while 11% reported self-harm and 5% said they had attempted suicide. So what we're seeing here is a real divergence and an increasing issue in relation to particularly the mental health of young women. Why the disparity? We've pulled a lot of this out. Increased prevalence of self-harm and suicidality, eating issues and body dysmorphia, pressure around appearances, including unrealistic expectations of women's bodies, and then the corresponding pressure around cosmetic surgery or changing the way that you look externally, peer pressure and comparison compounded by social media, and generally higher rates of anxiety, social anxiety, health anxiety made worse obviously by COVID, generalised anxiety disorders and others. All of the above compound this sense of disembodiment and not enoughness, which is the antithesis of when we speak about authenticity. On a systemic level then, in February 2023, the UK government declared gender-based violence a national threat on par with terrorism and serious organised crime. Now this was a welcome move in that it confirmed to a lot of us working within this sector what we know and have known for a very long time. But to put that into perspective for you all, it's a national threat. Gender-based violence is so kind of epidemic and serious that that's the level of threat that we are working with. 1 in 6 under 18-year-olds experience sexual abuse. 1 in 15 young people under 18 experience domestic abuse each year. And 1 in 3 women will go on to experience sexual violence or domestic abuse at some point in their lives. Less than 40% will seek help. Less than 10% will go to the police, and less than 1% will get a conviction. Every time I read these stats, they never get easier. And especially, I am in the 99%. I didn't get a conviction. It's a huge issue on a systemic level. And to bust a bit of a myth around sexual violence, of the 70,000 rapes perpetrated in the UK each year, 80% of the perpetrators are known to the victim. So this idea that we have of the way that rape looks, which is a stranger in a dark alley and all of those things, that isn't how this predominantly manifests. And because people aren't aware of that, they think that what happened to them didn't count, or that wasn't what that was, because it didn't look the way that we see it in the media. So it's really important, and I just really want to kind of bust that myth or that idea that it's somebody that is, a stranger and that's how this looks. Actually, it's usually somebody that you know and somebody that you trust. What's the reality within schools then? A recent study suggested in an average class of 30 children, there will be 8 boys who admire toxic masculinity influencers such as Andrew Tate. I find this so concerning. The prevalence of these toxic masculinity influencers is rife. They use TikTok to perpetuate views that women should stay at home, that they are owned by their boyfriends, that they're possession, that men are entitled to sex, and that taking no for an answer shows weakness. It's worth saying, obviously, this does not benefit women. It also does not benefit men. So this isn't just harmful for girls, this is really harmful for boys as well. Boys as young as 9 in a South London school have recently been reported as stating that if a girl goes back to the house, then it can't be classed as rape. So if you consent to go into somebody's house, then that counts as consent for anything and everything that might happen thereafter. While in another primary school, 4 boys locked a girl in a cupboard, threatened to rape her graphically and forced her to watch porn. These are primary school kids. And I think that you all have a massive opportunity as educators to get ahead of this. And actually, I would go as far as to say it's not just an opportunity, but it's an obligation. This has to shift, and you are in a huge position of opportunity to be able to influence some of this. There are ongoing debates with the Department of Health as to whether this should be covered in PHSE lessons, with increasing calls by schools for support in combating these areas. There is not the appetite to mandate this through PHSE at the moment, and that perpetuates the problem that we talked about earlier, which is silence perpetuates abuse. Only through communication can we get ahead of these issues. And if we don't fill the void with positive messages, accurate messages, then something else will, and something else is, i.e. TikTok, Andrew Tate, others. And it's a particularly unique challenge in all girls' schools because there's limited exposure to these kind of issues. So without targeted education and conversation, then they're going into adulthood unprepared. You know, for me, I went to a Catholic all-girls school. We had one conversation about sex and the message was, don't. And that was pretty much it. And then off we all upped and went to different cities without our support systems, without our families and friends, to navigate university and kind of face them with all of these issues all at once, without any parameters and without any idea of what was acceptable. So you go into a relationship, and if it hasn't been talked about, and if everything you see is relatively kind of toxic and patriarchal, then you don't know that what you're experiencing is okay or if it's not. And then that perpetuates this silence. So how does this show up in individuals then? This is a training that I use in big corporates, but it applies here as well, and I've tailored it slightly. So how do you spot the signs and identify the impact? And it's the 3 Ps. You're looking for presence, performance, and physicality. So under presence, arriving at school late, increases in sickness, spending an unusual number of hours at school for no particular reason, which can indicate that there's something at home that they're avoiding. Changes in behaviour, becoming quiet, anxious, frightened, aggressive, distracted. Isolation from friends, not joining in, not socialising in ways they would have before, and secrecy about home life and relationships in particular. Another one in relation to this is something that I see more frequently than I would like, is suddenly having loads of really expensive items where they wouldn't have before. And if you ask where they got them from, there's a caginess. That can be symptomatic of somebody who's being exploited, who has these things being purchased for them in exchange for or under a condition of various behaviours. Performance, quality of work deteriorating or being affected by frequent text messages, phone calls, a preoccupation or avoidance with their phones. There's something really insidious and a kind of indirect impact of sexual violence or domestic abuse in terms of your performance. And speaking personally in terms of my professional life and my work career, the way that it can show up can be really quite nuanced in that if you have had an experience that has so fundamentally undermined your own self-esteem and your self-worth, are you going to go for promotion? Are you going to have confidence that you can do that thing, that you can stretch yourself, that you can step outside of your comfort zone? In my case, no. I share this story. I was starting a graduate scheme where I was so ready to go in all guns blazing and smash it and do, you know, what I had been waiting to do. I had peers who were doing the same. And I remember a particularly dry 4-hour finance meeting and I couldn't stay awake. I was falling asleep in meetings where I was supposed to be thriving, and the reason was I had PTSD symptoms from what had happened to me. My brain wasn't online, but nobody had told me that, so I just thought in addition to what was going on, I was now failing professionally as well, and that really damaged my sense of self, it damaged my career progression, and took me even further out of authenticity. Physicality, these ones are perhaps more obvious. Visible bruising or injuries with unlikely explanations, changes in clothing, such as wearing long sleeves to hide injuries, changes in appearance, for example, in the use and pattern of makeup, either starting to wear more makeup to hide any injuries that could be a consequence of assault or domestic abuse, or stopping wearing makeup entirely because they have somebody saying to them, who are you putting lipstick on to impress? You're not going out looking like that, for example. How does this relate to authenticity then? So authenticity is the degree to which a person's actions are congruent with his or her desires despite external pressure or social conformity. It's the quality of being real and true, an inherent knowing of your own enoughness. It's an inside job, the answer never lies externally. And the opposite of authenticity is losing connection with your essence and living life behind a veil. So for me, I created Sparkle because my mum had said to me, kind of about a year after the assault, she looked in my eyes and she said, "You've got your sparkle back." And I said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "I didn't think that I would see that again." And situations like those that we've been discussing fundamentally sever you from your sense of self, from that essence, the thing that makes you you, which is authenticity. And it forms the bedrock for autonomy, self-esteem, self-worth, self-trust, knowing what's right for us and what isn't, what feels okay and what doesn't. If we don't know what is okay for us, then we don't know what's not. So you have to be able to understand your benchmarks and your parameters. I'm going to do a brief practice with you all, and I'm mindful of time, so I'm going to speed it up slightly. We'll do a brief breathwork practice, and I'm going to invite you to think of a time where you have felt really authentic and aligned, and a time where you have felt totally out of authenticity and not in alignment. So I invite you all, if you feel comfortable, put both feet on the floor. You can close your eyes if you feel comfortable to do that, or you can just kind of soften your gaze. We're going to do a short breathwork exercise that I'll talk you through. We'll do 2 rounds of breath, and then I'm going to ask you to call those 2 things to mind. And when I do, I just want you to notice how each of those situations feel in your body. So we're going to do what's called box breathing, which is breathing in for 4, holding for 4, breathing out for 4, then holding for 4. And we'll do 2 rounds of that. So I invite you all to breathe in, 2, 3, 4, and hold, 2, 3, 4. Breathe out, 2, 3, 4, and hold, 2, 3, 4. Breathe in, 2, 3, 4, and hold. And breathe out, 2, 3, 4, and hold. And I just invite you to call into mind a time that you can think of where you have felt really authentic and aligned, where you felt really connected to the essence of yourself. And I want you to just notice how that feels in your body. Perhaps your shoulders relax, maybe you feel a little bit lighter, a bit more at ease. And now I want you to think about a time where you have felt really out of authenticity, where something's really jarred with you, or you haven't felt yourself. And call into mind that time, and just notice how your body changes in response to that. Maybe your breathing's a bit more shallow. Maybe you feel a tightness or a tension, pressure on your chest. And when you feel ready, just become aware of the room again and open your eyes. Welcome back. And I just want to invite you all to share, how does being out of authenticity feel for you? When you were out of authenticity, what were you kind of experiencing? What sensations were you noticing? Just shout out words or tight chest. Yeah, me too.
Shallow breathing and little.
Making yourself smaller. Yep, for sure. Thank you.
High heart rate.
Yeah, that fight or flight response sometimes, that anxiety. Brilliant. So that's what we hear. Being out of authenticity feels fear-based, off-kilter, just unsteady, unsure, doubtful. What about the reverse? When you felt into authenticity, how did that feel in your body?
Flow.
Flow, wonderful, thank you.
Grounded.
Grounded, nice. Perfect, thanks. Relaxed, great. Also what we hear, grounded, confident, solid, safe, self-assured. Then authenticity, by default, creates a far stronger foundation for young women to be able to deal with and respond to the systemic issues and thrive and build a life and a career that fulfills them. So it's not just about not, responding to trauma or how you deal with that. It's also about making really good choices about the degree that you choose or not, the path that you decide to go down, the job that you take, the relationship that you get into. All of those big decisions are far easier and more aligned when you come from a place of authenticity. And the first step always for me is supporting girls, young women, to get them quiet and reconnect with their own bodies and their sense of self. It's such a travesty to me that we ask women to look outside of themselves for what's right for them, when in actuality, the answer is always within. What can you do then, as schools, as individuals, to combat those broader systemic issues? You can ensure that appropriate support's available. Early intervention by someone who's relatable, feels like them, is crucial in improving outcomes and avoiding re-victimisation. Another really unhelpful stat that I was told just after I was assaulted was, you're far more likely for it to happen again now. Brilliant. Thanks, that feels great. So statistically that is true, but perhaps don't lead with that. The Sparkle Scholarship, so that is a mentorship program that I told you a little bit about at the start, specifically for young people who've experienced abuse. The changes that we see in women and the outcomes that we see are phenomenal, and it's just one of my favourite things to do. It really is. Train your staff. These issues are specialist and can be difficult. Appropriate training is crucial, and ensure staff feel confident and capable in dealing with these matters. Know what services exist and what to do if faced with a concern or a disclosure, and make sure your policies are robust. Consider enforcing a specific VOG strategy within your schools or associations. What are you doing systemically as institutions to be able to make sure that your response to this is changing the face of the problem? And be part of the solution. Proactively discuss the issues we've talked about today, which challenges the patriarchal culture and begins to dismantle these systems that perpetuate abuse. I'm going to circulate this afterwards because I'm mindful of time, so I'm going to share this so that you have it. But how to respond to a disclosure in a way that does no harm. Here are my kind of top tips, and I'm going to make sure that you have that afterwards. And be aware of what stops someone from disclosing experiencing abuse. These can be things like feeling like nothing will be done or that they wouldn't be believed, not knowing if it counted, thinking that it wasn't that bad, that it wasn't worth sharing, fear of retaliation or consequence, misplaced guilt and shame, narratives about ruining people's lives or the impact it might have on others. And because it's become normalised, so you don't see the signs, you think it's okay, or you don't realise that it's happened or is happening. In summary then, what authenticity is, it's doing what is real and true to you, what feels right, it's an inside job, and it's discovering your own unique essence. And what it isn't is doing what other people think that you should, doing something that you're good at but you don't enjoy, doing what everyone around you is doing, or doing things to fit in. And as I said at the start, schools have a unique opportunity to support and combat the broader systemic issues that impact women and girls in the 21st century. And I'm delighted to be in rooms like this where it feels like home and people I can tell are aligned and doing great work, and you just feel sometimes when you're with your people, and that's great, and that feels really good to be here with you all. And I encourage you all to keep going and keep doing what you're doing. And if there's any way that we can help through the Sparkle Scholarship, through education and training, through support with your VOG strategy, or for Authentically Me, the programme that myself and Anne have developed, we actually have a one-pager kind of leaflet here. If you're interested in learning more about that, then we would love to continue to support you in the fight to end violence against women and girls. I invite any questions, and I really just thank you all for your time.
Do you run workshops with boys and girls together?
That isn't something that we've done yet. And to be honest, the bulk of the focus so far has been on girls, but working with boys is something that me and Anne talk about and that we're particularly interested in. It's interesting to see how that plays out. Sometimes the initial stage is better done separately because of the things that might come up in the room or what people may or may not feel comfortable to share in a group setting. But I absolutely think so much of violence against women and girls stuff is reactive and like people trying to scrape bits and pieces together and do the best that they can. Building on that is absolutely that integrative piece where you've got girls and boys together and you are dealing with this as a holistic issue.